The late afternoon sun, a molten gold disk sinking towards the tree line, cast long dancing shadows across the surface of the water, each ripple a fractured mirror of the sky. My son, barely 13, was a silhouette of concentration on our dock, his fishing rod a delicate extension of his arm, the line a silver thread disappearing into the cool, dark depths of the lake. This was his sanctuary, my land, our peace. The gentle lapping of waves against the pylons of the dock was the only sound, a rhythmic sigh that usually settled deep in my chest, a counterpoint to the cacophony of my profession. Today, however, that peace was about to be violated with a brutality that would ignite a cold, precise fury I usually reserved for the worst dregs of humanity. I was inside, reviewing some case files, the window offering a perfect vantage of the shoreline and my son when the disturbance began. A figure, puffed up with a misplaced sense of authority, clad in a vaguely official-looking polo shirt, emblazoned with the pretentious crest of the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association, strode onto my property, making a direct line for our dock. I recognized him instantly. Bernard Grimshaw, self-appointed Grand Inquisitor of Lawn Heights and Mailbox Uniformity for the neighborhood. But this was different. He wasn't carrying his usual clipboard of infractions. There was a tension in his approach, a swagger that bordered on the menacing. My son, startled, looked up. I saw Grimshaw gesticulating, his voice a faint, angry buzz I couldn't quite make out. Then, the unthinkable. Grimshaw's hand went to his hip, and he produced a handgun. A real, honest-to-God weapon. He wasn't just pointing it vaguely, he was bringing it up, his arm extending, the muzzle starting to align with my son. My son, fishing. On our own dock. The world narrowed to a pinpoint. The files in my hand scattered. There was no thought, only instinct honed by years of training, by situations where hesitation meant death. Before the weapon could fully level, before my boy could even process the metallic glint of impending terror, I was moving. They didn't know. They never knew. This pathetic excuse for a man, this tin-pot tyrant playing cops and robbers, had just crossed a line etched in blood and duty, a line that demarcated civilization from the savage idiocy he was now embodying. He was about to learn the true meaning of authority and the precise, legally lethal consequences of threatening what was mine on my land. The distance from my porch to the dock was perhaps 30 yards, but I covered it in a blur, my mind a supercooled chamber of tactical assessment. Grimshaw was still posturing, his attention fixed on my son, who stood frozen, the fishing rod clattering to the wooden planks. The man was an amateur, his stance sloppy, his grip on the weapon betraying a lack of familiarity that made him even more dangerous. An idiot with a gun is a grenade with a loose pin. My approach was silent, my bare feet making no sound on the grass, then the ramp to the dock. He never heard me. One moment, he was lecturing my terrified son about some imagined HOA bylaw concerning unauthorized recreational activities on common area water features, an absurdity, given this was private property. My property the next, my left hand clamped down on his wrist, a vice of bone and sinew, forcing the muzzle of the gun skyward. Simultaneously, my right hand snaked around, palm striking the back of his hand with percussive force, a nerve strike designed to elicit an involuntary release. The weapon, a cheap Saturday night special, clattered onto the dock, skittering near the edge. Grimshaw let out a surprised yelp, his eyes wide with shock as he was spun around, his arm now torqued behind him in a compliance hold that brought him to his knees with a grunt of pain. "Federal offense, Mr. Grimshaw," I stated, my voice devoid of heat, a flat, hard delivery that belied the inferno raging within. "Aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. On a minor. On private property." I cinched the hold tighter, feeling the pop of a tendon. He gasped. "You have no idea the kind of trouble you're in." My son was staring, his face pale, but the initial terror was being replaced by a dawning awareness. He knew that tone in my voice. It was the tone that meant things were being handled irrevocably. I kicked the discarded weapon further away from Grimshaw, its metallic ugliness, a stain on the weathered wood of our dock, a stark contrast to the peaceful waters of the lake. The air still hummed with the violence of the moment, the sudden intrusion of mortal threat into a child's idyllic afternoon. This wasn't just an overreach. It was a declaration of war by a delusional fool, and he was about to discover he'd brought a clipboard to a gunfight he couldn't possibly win, because the real authority had just entered the arena. His pathetic attempt to enforce non-existent rules with an illegal threat was about to unravel his entire pretend kingdom. "You can't do this," Grimshaw sputtered, his face contorted with pain and disbelief, as I retrieved his discarded weapon, ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and tucked the now safe gun into my waistband. "I'm HOA security. I have authority here." His voice was a pathetic whine, the bluster deflating like a punctured lung. I looked down at him, the self-proclaimed enforcer of trivial neighborhood regulations, now a trembling heap on my dock. "No, Mr. Grimshaw," I said, my voice still unnervingly calm, the cold-blooded calm that precedes a storm. "You have nothing. What you have is a collection of felonies you've just committed in front of multiple witnesses, one of whom is my son." I pulled out my own credentials, the polished metal star catching the dying sunlight, reflecting a miniature inferno back into his rapidly paling face. "Sheriff Frank Ramsey, Oak Haven County. And you, sir, are on my land, threatening my family." The color drained completely from Grimshaw's face, replaced by a sickly mottled gray. His eyes, moments before alight with a petty tyrant's glee, were now wide with genuine, unadulterated terror. The word sheriff hung in the air, heavy and immutable. He started to stammer, a string of incoherent apologies and excuses. I ignored him. My priority was my son. I knelt beside him, gently placing a hand on his shoulder. "You okay, champ?" His nod was shaky, but his eyes met mine, a flicker of the fear receding. He said I was trespassing on the lake." A small, incredulous laugh almost escaped me. The sheer, unmitigated gall. "He was wrong, son. Very wrong." I turned back to Grimshaw, whose pathetic attempts at explanation were dissolving into whimpers. "This entire lake, Mr. Grimshaw," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, a tone far more menacing than any shout. "From the northernmost tributary to the southern dam, every drop of water, every inch of shoreline, every fish swimming in its depths, and certainly this dock, belongs to me, personally. It's not HOA common ground. It's not subject to your ridiculous, overreaching covenants. It's my private property. You weren't just threatening my son, you were trespassing, armed, on the private estate of the county sheriff." The realization seemed to hit him with the force of a physical blow. He slumped, all resistance gone. The waves lapped gently, a mocking counterpoint to the drama. The HOA police had just tried to arrest the lake owner's son on the lake owner's dock, and the lake owner happened to be the damn sheriff. The irony was so thick, it was almost a physical presence. My deputies arrived within minutes, their sirens a distant wail growing rapidly closer, a sound that, for Grimshaw, must have been the tolling of a funeral bell for his delusions of grandeur. 2 cruisers pulled up at the edge of my property line, lights painting the trees in strobing blues and reds. Sergeant Miller, a man I'd trusted for 15 years, led the way, his expression grimly professional, until he saw me, my son, and the pathetic, crumpled figure of Grimshaw. "Sheriff? Everything all right, sir?" he asked, his gaze flicking to the weapon I now held as evidence. "Not entirely, Miller," I replied, my voice tight with residual anger. This individual, one Bernard Grimshaw, representing the Lakeside Estates HOA, decided to pull a firearm on my son while he was fishing on our dock. He claims my son was trespassing. Miller's eyebrows shot up. He knew, as did everyone in the department, that I owned the entire Blackwood Lake and its surrounding acreage. It was a well-known fact, one that Grimshaw and his little band of HOA martinets had apparently, conveniently or arrogantly, overlooked. "He didn't know who you were, sir?" Miller asked, a hint of disbelief in his tone. "He didn't know I was the sheriff, and he clearly didn't know I owned this entire body of water and all the land it touches." He was operating under the thoroughly mistaken impression that his HOA rules applied to my private property. As Miller and his partner cuffed Grimshaw, reading him his Miranda rights with a practiced, almost bored cadence, I explained the full situation. The illegal brandishing, the assault, the trespassing, the impersonation of authority with that ridiculous HOA security persona, and the deadly weapon he was clearly not qualified or authorized to carry in such a manner. The Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association. I'd heard whispers about their increasingly aggressive tactics, their harassment of residents over the most trivial of perceived infractions. This neighborhood, adjacent to my larger estate, had become a hotbed of petty tyranny, all orchestrated by a board drunk on minuscule power. They had finally, monumentally, overstepped. They had brought their nonsense to my doorstep, to my family, onto my land, and they had done it with a firearm. The consequences would be biblical. This wasn't just about one idiot with a gun. This was about dismantling an organization that had become a blight, a source of constant harassment, and now a clear and present danger. The ripples from this incident wouldn't just disturb the surface of my lake. They would swamp the entire HOA. The subsequent investigation into Bernard Grimshaw and the Lakeside Estates HOA was swift and, for them, brutally efficient. It turned out Grimshaw had a prior conviction for aggravated menacing in another state, making his possession of a firearm highly illegal. The weapon itself was unregistered. He wasn't a licensed security guard, and his HOA security getup was a self-made costume designed to intimidate. He was, in essence, a dangerous fantasist enabled by an HOA board that had completely lost its collective mind. My office, in conjunction with the county prosecutor, threw the book at him: aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, child endangerment, felon in possession of a firearm, impersonating a law enforcement official, a stretch perhaps, but his actions bordered on it, and armed criminal trespassing. He wasn't getting out on bail. But my focus, my legally lethal intent, quickly expanded beyond Grimshaw. The HOA itself was culpable. Their minutes, subpoenaed and reviewed with surgical precision, revealed a pattern of escalating overreach, of encouraging and sanctioning Grimshaw's aggressive enforcement tactics. There were complaints from other residents, previously dismissed or ignored by the board, detailing harassment, intimidation, and illegal fining practices. They had created this monster, fed his delusions, and were now going to be held accountable for his actions and their own systemic corruption. They didn't know I was a lawyer before I became sheriff, did they? I mused to Miller, looking over a stack of HOA internal documents that read like the fever dream of a tin-pot dictator. The bylaws were a convoluted mess, often contradictory and, in several key areas, patently illegal, attempting to assert authority over areas well beyond their legal purview, including, it seemed, parts of my lake's watershed which they'd tried to claim as HOA-controlled green space on their outdated neighborhood maps. The sheer audacity was breathtaking. I instructed my legal team to prepare civil actions alongside the criminal proceedings. The HOA had insurance, of course, but I doubted it covered gross negligence leading to felony assaults committed by their unhinged, illegally armed stooge. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about eradication. A cancer like this HOA couldn't be treated, it had to be excised. The calm waters of my lake had been disturbed, and the storm I was unleashing would cleanse the entire shoreline of their toxic presence. The first wave of the counteroffensive was financial, designed to cripple. My legal team, armed with meticulously documented evidence of years of unauthorized incursions onto my property by various HOA representatives, not just Grimshaw, but landscapers they'd hired who'd dumped debris on my undeveloped shoreline, survey teams they'd sent without permission, and even their community watch volunteers who'd been spotted using binoculars to peer at my house from the edge of my land, drafted a series of trespassing notices and demands for damages that would make their accountants weep. Each documented incursion was itemized, dated, and assigned a hefty fine, perfectly within my rights as a private landowner to demand compensation for unauthorized use and access. The beauty of it was its absolute legality. They had trespassed repeatedly. They had been caught. They would pay. The aggregate sum was astronomical, enough to bankrupt their operating budget several times over. I envisioned the HOA board meeting where these documents, delivered by a stoic process server, landed on their polished mahogany table. The shock, the denial, the dawning realization that their reign of petty terror was about to be foreclosed upon. The official letterhead of the Oakhaven County Sheriff's Department, my personal letterhead, in this instance, as landowner, added a particular sting. It wasn't just some disgruntled resident. It was the chief law enforcement officer of the county, whose son, their enforcer, had threatened with a gun on land they had no claim to. Then came the charges against the HOA itself, as an entity, for negligence in hiring and supervision, for creating a public nuisance, and for a pattern of harassment that had clearly culminated in Grimshaw's violent outburst. The initial court filings were a matter of public record, and news travels fast in a small county. The Lakeside Estates OA versus reality headlines practically wrote themselves. Their carefully constructed facade of respectable community governance was crumbling under the weight of their own arrogance and illegality. The surgical precision I applied to crime scenes was now being applied to their finances and their legal standing. They had picked a fight with someone who not only had the will, but also the means and the moral imperative to finish it, decisively and with extreme prejudice. The quiet satisfaction I felt was cold, hard, and utterly justified. This was not vengeance. This was the restoration of order, a necessary recalibration of boundaries they had willfully ignored. The waves of my lake seemed to echo that sentiment, each ripple a small, satisfied sigh. The next step was the ban. As the owner of Blackwood Lake and its extensive surrounding properties, I had every right to control access. The Lakeside Estates HOA, through its reckless and dangerous actions, had forfeited any goodwill or implied permission to utilize any part of my land or the water itself. I drafted a formal, legally binding notice, citing the recent aggravated assault, the history of trespassing, and the clear danger posed by their unsupervised and unvetted enforcement personnel. Effective immediately, any member, agent, contractor, or representative of the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association was permanently barred from setting foot on any property owned by Frank Ramsey, which included the entirety of Blackwood Lake, its shoreline, access points that crossed my land, and any adjacent undeveloped parcels. Violators would be arrested and prosecuted for trespassing. No exceptions, no warnings. I had new, very clear, no trespassing private property, violators will be prosecuted signs made, larger and more numerous than before, specifically naming the Lakeside Estates HOA as a prohibited entity. My deputies were instructed to patrol the boundaries more frequently, not just for general security, but with a specific eye towards any HOA-affiliated individuals attempting to test my resolve. The HOA president, a pompous woman named Agnes Periwinkle, who bore a startling resemblance to a surprised owl, requested an urgent meeting. I granted it, in my office, with Miller present as a witness and my attorney on speakerphone. She blustered, she pleaded, she threatened vaguely worded legal action of her own. Sheriff Ramsey, this is an outrage. Our residents have enjoyed access to the lake for years. This is an abuse of your power." Her voice quivered with indignation. I leaned back in my chair, my expression unreadable. "Mrs. Periwinkle," I began, my tone glacial, "let me be exceptionally clear. Your enforcer, Mr. Grimshaw, pulled an illegal firearm on my 13-year-old son, who was fishing on my dock, on my land. Your HOA sanctioned his behavior. Your HOA has a documented history of trespassing on my property. My power, as you put it, in this instance, stems not from my badge, but from my deed to the land. It is my private property. You and your association are no longer welcome on it, due to the clear and present danger you represent. This is not a negotiation. This is a statement of fact. The ban is permanent and non-negotiable." Her face went from flushed to ashen. The fight drained out of her. The threats of legal action died on her lips when my attorney coolly interjected, outlining the potential for a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the HOA and its board members personally, for negligence and endangerment. The climactic confrontation was less a bang and more a whimper. The public, or at least semi-public in my office, embarrassment total. The HOA's reign of terror over the neighborhood was effectively neutered, their access to the primary local amenity, Lake severed. The aftermath was quiet, subdued. The Lakeside Estates neighborhood, previously buzzing with the low-grade anxiety of HOA scrutiny, seemed to breathe a collective, if cautious, sigh of relief. Grimshaw was remanded without bail, facing serious prison time. The HOA itself was imploding under the weight of legal fees, fines, and the sudden, stark realization that their authority was a house of cards built on sand that had just been washed away by a tidal wave. Several board members resigned immediately. Agnes Periwinkle was rumored to be consulting with bankruptcy lawyers. The other residents of Lakeside Estates, the silent majority, suddenly found their voices, and many of them were expressing gratitude, albeit privately, for the dismantling of the HOA's oppressive regime. My son, after the initial shock, recovered quickly. We went fishing on our dock the very next evening. The setting sun was just as beautiful, the water just as calm, but something had shifted. The peace felt deeper, more secure, reclaimed. The porch light, when I switched it on later, wasn't just a beacon, it was a symbol of control restored, of a boundary fiercely defended. The metaphorical locked gate on my property now felt forged of reinforced steel. There was a somber resilience in the air, a quiet acknowledgement of the line that had been crossed and the decisive response it had necessitated. I felt no triumph, only a grim satisfaction. This wasn't a victory to be celebrated. It was a dirty job that had to be done. The protective loyalty I felt for my family had been tested, and I had met the challenge with the full, cold, calculated force of my capabilities. The moral cost of action? The only cost was to those who had so arrogantly presumed to threaten what was sacred, to impose their petty tyranny where it had no right to be. They paid dearly, and justly. The lake, my lake, was once again a place of solace, not a battleground. The waves continued their gentle rhythm against the shoreline, indifferent to the human dramas that played out, yet somehow they felt cleaner, the water purer, now that the contamination had been purged. The news of the HOA's spectacular implosion, precipitated by their idiotic decision to send an armed thug to menace my son on my own land, spread through the county like wildfire. It became a cautionary tale, a stark example of what happens when petty power meets immovable resolve and legitimate authority. Other HOAs in the region reportedly held emergency meetings to review their own bylaws and enforcement protocols, suddenly very interested in the precise definitions of private property and the limits of their jurisdiction. It was a lesson learned vicariously, but learned nonetheless. My actions were not born of malice, but of necessity. When your child is threatened, when your home is invaded, when the sanctity of your land is violated by those drunk on imaginary power and armed with real weapons, the response must be absolute. There is no room for negotiation when the threat is existential. I didn't seek this conflict, but when it arrived on my dock under the guise of HOA police, pointing an illegal gun at my boy, I ended it with the surgical precision and unwavering moral conviction that my life, my training, and my profound love for my family demanded. The lake remains. The water is clear. The shoreline is secure. My son fishes without fear, and the message is unequivocal. Some lines are not to be crossed. Some sanctuaries are not to be violated. Those who forget this, who believe their petty rules supersede fundamental rights and the sanctity of one's own land, will discover that the pushback is not merely legal, but elemental. They will find themselves facing a cold-blooded calm with explosive emotional undercurrents, a force that will dismantle their delusions and restore the natural order with dramatic, and, if necessary, legally lethal precision. Let them all take note. My land, my rules, my peace. Trespassers, especially those with delusions of authority and illegally held weapons, will be dealt with permanently. The finality of the HOA's downfall resonated through the community for months. What began as a shocking act of injustice, Grimshaw's gun pointed at my son, transformed into a public reckoning, a systematic deconstruction of an abusive entity. The initial tactical retaliation, disarming that fool on our dock, was merely the opening salvo. The true power lay not just in the immediate physical control, but in the subsequent methodical application of law and ownership. The revelation that I was not only the sheriff, but also the sole proprietor of the entire lake and its surrounding acreage, acted as a force multiplier. Their petty harassment, which had undoubtedly plagued other residents of the neighborhood, had finally targeted someone with the unique combination of authority, resources, and personal motivation to bring their entire corrupt edifice crashing down. The legal filings piled up against them, each one a precisely aimed shot. On-screen text, if this were a movie, would have scrolled endless lists of citations, fines, and court dates. The visual metaphor of the fence, once perhaps just a property marker, now stood as an unbreachable wall of defiance against any future overreach. The arrest warrant for Grimshaw was just the beginning. The true arrest was of the HOA's unchecked power. Their internal documents, emails, and financial records, once tools of their petty tyranny, became exhibits in their prosecution and civil dismantling. The local corruption I suspected within their own board mismanagement of funds, self-dealing began to surface as disgruntled former members, seeing the writing on the wall, started cooperating with the county prosecutor's inquiries into their broader activities. The climactic confrontation with Mrs. Promise Periwinkle in my office was a quiet demolition, her bluster collapsing into stunned silence as the full weight of her organization's folly became undeniable. My inner monologue throughout this entire affair was a cold, steady rhythm of tactical assessment and moral justification. Each step: Step 1, neutralize immediate threat. Step 2, secure my family. Step 3, assert legal authority. Step 4, dismantle the offending organization was executed with a chilling calm that masked a righteous fury. The short, declarative sentences of my internal and external commands were designed for control, for clarity, for ensuring that the message was unmistakable. The waves on my lake are calm now, the shoreline undisturbed. My son's fishing expeditions are once again the peaceful pastime they were always meant to be. The blood in this conflict was metaphorical, the draining of power and legitimacy from an organization that had abused its charter. The psychological closure came not just from Grimshaw's incarceration, but from the complete dissolution of the Lakeside Estates HOA, its assets liquidated to pay fines and damages, its name a byword for arrogance brought low. It was a first-person retaliation opera, and the final curtain had fallen on their absurd little drama. The ripples of that confrontation spread far beyond the confines of our neighborhood. The tale of the HOA police who pulled a gun on the sheriff's son, on the sheriff's own dock, on the sheriff's own lake, became a legend of sorts, a stark warning whispered in other communities where HOAs were flexing their often overinflated muscles. My office received a surprising number of calls, not complaints, but inquiries, from other citizens entangled in disputes with their own associations, seeking advice. Emboldened by the public dismantling of lakeside estates, it seemed my intensely personal battle had inadvertently become a beacon for others. The dramatic lighting change, metaphorically speaking, occurred the moment Grimshaw's weapon was revealed. The idyllic scene plunged into shadow, only to be relit by the harsh, exposing glare of justice. His gun was not just a weapon, it was the fulcrum upon which their entire precarious power structure tipped into oblivion. The supporting characters in this drama played their parts. My son, the innocent catalyst and emotional anchor whose violation triggered the unyielding response. My deputies, the swift arm of legitimate law enforcement, contrasting sharply with Grimshaw's fraudulent authority. The neighbors, once cowed by the HOA, became a silent chorus witnessing the fall of their local tyrant. Fodder for a rebellion of common sense that would see them eventually form a far more reasonable community association, one focused on actual upkeep rather than draconian rulemaking. The legal battle was, in essence, a tactical operation, each filing a carefully planned maneuver, each court appearance a strategic engagement. My legal jargon, honed over years, became my weaponized narration, precise and deadly. The surprise reversal was total. They thought they were enforcing rules. They discovered they were committing crimes against the one man in the county who could and would bring the full weight of the law and private property rights down upon them. The fence around my property, especially the sections bordering the now defunct HOA's former territory, became a symbol of this reclaimed sovereignty, a clear demarcation between lawful order and the chaos they had attempted to sow. The porch light on my house shines brighter now, a small beacon of defiance and control, a testament to the fact that on my land, under my watch, such outrages will not stand. The water of the lake reflects this quiet triumph, its surface a mirror to the restored peace.